I wanted to sort of really just have a bit of a conversation, not just about sort of critical raw materials, but the broader role that we're seeing around mining and obviously manufacturing, the connection that this has for the rest of Africa. And from a Minerals Council point of view, what we're really interested in is what are the kind of policy instruments, what are the longer term strategic decisions we can be making that can enable these things to happen. And I think that we have to start from the real macroeconomic questions when we're talking about these issues, right? And the first question we'd ask is, what does our trade look like? Who do we trade with? Where are we going? And how does this trade function from not just a manufacturing point of view, but from a minerals point of view? And I think that when we start looking at this, we realize that there is, particularly when it comes to metals and minerals, there is going to be an enormous shift over the next 20, 30, 40 years around how and where these things happen. So if you look at many of the metals that South Africa is producing that are in demand, potentially things like your PGMs, there is a big push for a circular economy style movement in the rest of the world. And part of this has to do with the way that their economies are structured. So in Europe, they already have established infrastructure, and their question is not so much around building new infrastructure, but how do they recycle the infrastructure that they have? They already have millions of cars. How do they recycle and utilize those effectively from an economic point of view, as opposed to create new vehicles? In Africa, we have a very different problem. And if you look across the continent, we have questions like how do we move, for example, from the 50-odd% urbanization across Africa to 80% urbanization, which is ballpark figure about 300 to 400 million people that will move from rural areas into the cities over the next 30 to 50 years. We're essentially building an entire Europe or an entire United States over the next 30 to 40 years. Now, we can't recycle to achieve that. That has to be new construction, new materials, new minerals. And so the economic drivers behind these things are very, very different between a Europe or a China or a US compared to what the opportunities are for us in Africa. And I think this speaks to then a number of additional issues around mining and manufacturing. So first of all, what are the kind of minerals and commodities that are going to be demanded for this? And these are obviously not going to be necessarily rare earths directly in terms of bulks. We're talking about like aggregates and steel and copper and all of your base infrastructure minerals. And one of the things that Professor Nex was talking about earlier is, should we reclassify what critical materials are? Like, do we use water? Do we talk about phosphates? Do we talk about all of these additional materials that are critical for our development purposes as opposed to the development purposes of Germany, for example? So this is kind of one sort of interesting question. But kind of connected to this is to say, well, these new sort of construction opportunities, these new infrastructure opportunities need to be done by someone. Now, it doesn't make sense, of course, to ship iron ore from South Africa, from Sishen up to Kenya, right? And that's never going to happen. Not only because it's really heavy to move it up there, but there's no rail infrastructure. So first of all, we can ask about sort of, is there an opportunity around rail infrastructure and things like this? And that's a useful and important point. But more importantly, we have the manufacturing capability to support mining industries across the continent. Now, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, South Africa still produced the bulk of mining equipment into the rest of Africa. And that is no longer the case. So our local mining manufacturers simply don't sort of dominate the mining market in South Africa, or the mining equipment market in South Africa, the way that they used to. Now, if you go to a mine in Zimbabwe that's managed by Canadian GM, he's going to be buying in Canadian equipment. And if you go to Zambia and you have some Australian operators, they'll be buying Australian OEM stuff. And the bigger kind of like European OEMs are increasingly kind of importing your big equipment sort of into these operations. And there's two kind of components to this. So one is the actual equipment itself. And obviously we constantly want to move towards more and more advanced kit. And so the Atlas Copcos of this world and the Komatsus of this world are the guys producing the really big trucks, right? No one produces that in Africa. And so when you have to go and spend X numbers of hundreds of millions of dollars on your equipment. Where is this being done? It's being purchased from outside, not locally. So there's this immediate gap around the construction side of mining. The second thing, and this is increasingly going to become important for this whole fourth industrial revolution question, is the technology component that is embedded within our equipment. Now, it's one thing to say that, you know, we're going to have some great software, but the reality is that software itself is developed in Germany or the US or China or Japan. And it's not always obvious that we're paying for this, but all of the big data, all of the telecommunications which is embedded in that is ultimately also revenue that could have been accrued through South Africa, or South African manufacturing and South African services firms. So there's a whole range of trade questions that exist that are fundamental to how we drive the whole mining and mining manufacturing sector over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And it's not always obvious, but this is absolutely a trade war that is happening with us as a kind of third party in the middle. When you have people, you have guys like your Komatsus or your Caterpillars who are then pulling equipment into the country or into the rest of Africa. And once you are embedded, or once that system is embedded within a mining operation, it's very difficult to move out. If any of you have gone through some sort of SAP integration, once SAP is in your company, like, you will never get rid of SAP, right? You are then kind of like embedded in that system for the next 20 or 30 years. And this, I think, is going to become increasingly challenging as we build these systems from a manufacturing point of view, where you now have all of your kit running Atlas Copco, for example, and you are then contractually bound to Atlas Copco because they have all of the equipment and all of the software layers that sit between your management systems, and these guys are stuck in that process. So I've kind of deviated a little bit away from raw materials, but this is really important when it comes to the opportunities for South African manufacturing, because a mine in DRC, for example, where there are significant human health and safety challenges, from sort of civil unrest to tropical diseases, they're increasingly going to be operated remotely. You know, we're thinking 20, 30 years from now, you want to be able to have people operate an LHD from, I don't know, Australia. Now, as soon as that starts to happen, we've lost that mining operation forever. And so the manufacturing challenge that we have is, how do we ensure that we're able to develop the systems, the mining systems itself, that can be exported into the rest of Africa. Now, this kind of leads to a couple of questions, and sort of I want to bring this back then to the question of raw materials. So one of them was a point that, this was again made earlier, that there are no kind of, or in many cases, there are, for example, no significant deposits of many of these elements. Like, you're not going to find a tellurium deposit just like sitting there, right? It's always these co-located minerals, and you're going to need to sort of mine copper, you need to mine gold, you're going to need to mine platinum, and all these other things in order to produce all of these additional materials. And if we see that there needs to be a role for us in helping to break this Chinese monopoly of kind of utilizing and developing a lot of these industries within South Africa, we need to open up these mines. And the only way that we can open up these mines is if we are able to provide the technology and the IP and the systems to do that. Otherwise, ultimately, those things are going to go to all of our competitor nations. And this is kind of one of the challenges that we really are in this competitive environment. So the question of raw materials and manufacturing goes all the way back to sort of this whole trade economics, as well as the broader mining systems that we have to think about. So where are there challenges in this process? So from a South African perspective, there are a number of issues. First of all, the greenfield exploration in South Africa for actual sort of locally kind of mined minerals is tiny. So South Africa has around 1% of the total exploration budget globally, and around 1% of that is greenfields, if that. So we basically don't do any greenfield exploration here for all intents and purposes. And there is some work being done by CGS and some other guys, But really, if you compare our exploration spend compared to Canada or even like places like Zambia and DRC, it's tiny. And there's a lot of reasons for that from a policy point of view. We know from the experience with DMR over the last several years that there have been some policy challenges, and there's also been some personality challenges with the leadership of the DMR. And with Minister Mantashe coming in, that has sort of changed and evolved slightly. But policy certainty is a prerequisite for any kind of investment into exploration, and we're slowly getting towards that. Right? Mining charter is still something that is being kind of grappled with, and so this becomes a critical element for us to deal with in terms of how do we build an environment that first of all supports investment, right? And before investment comes exploration, and so that needs to be solved. A second critical issue that we need to think about is the market sizing for a lot of this work. So one of the reasons that South African manufacturers have never been able to scale up to the likes of the bigger OEMs, the bigger sort of multinational OEMs, is because the markets are just, the local markets are simply not large enough to justify that level of production. So if you were to go to a South African OEM and say, we want to order 50,000 rock drills, they simply don't have the manufacturing capability to produce those numbers. And so our entire manufacturing group is constrained in its ability to scale up. And that obviously means that local firms just won't go there, right? And this comes into this second question around, is there going to be a market for many of these materials in South Africa, or for the equipment to manufacture those things in South Africa or to process them? And unless we can close this entire loop, the simple answer is no. So we need to find a way of opening up our market, and from a manufacturing point of view, the biggest opportunity we have around that is, of course, Africa. So we have this African Free Trade Agreement. The African Mining Vision 2063 talks a lot about not just localization in the sort of national or provincial sense, but a broader localization to say, countries or operators in Ghana can access people in South Africa and still have this sort of idea of local content. So how do we utilize this bigger market that's being set up in order to boost manufacturing? And once that is done, it obviously cycles back to our ability to more efficiently operate mining equipment and mines in South Africa. And so one of the big kind of cost structures for mines beyond just labor is the capital costs, and almost all of that capital tends to be imported. So there is this kind of virtuous cycle that exists of, if we're able to scale up manufacturing, produce higher quality, lower cost manufacturing solutions, that leads to lower cost sort of mining operations that can absorb more demand, and that justifies the existence of new mining operations across the region. So there's this whole sort of collection of things that is really critical for us to build as a cluster. And it's this whole cluster approach that has been kind of the focus of the Minerals Council over the last several years. So coming out of a number of different public-private sort of agreements between the industry and government in particular, but together with the universities, there are a range of groups being set up to support this broader cluster development. So one of them, for example, is MEMSA, which is the Mining Equipment Manufacturers of South Africa, which represents this broader group of South African OEMs who are trying to engage more closely with the South African mining industry and provide solutions for them. The second one is the Mandela Mining Precinct, which again is this public-private organization between kind of coordinated through the CSIR, but together with WITS and UJ and UP, and then the mining companies, to identify a range of longer-term technology and innovation solutions for many of the mining kind of challenges around extension of life of mine, advanced ore body knowledge, and a range of different areas. These groups are starting to build this bigger cluster effect and trying to say, well, how do we deal with this problem systematically as opposed to individually? Now, one of the central questions around this, and this is something that needs to be done together with, for example, CGS, is building up a proper geological atlas of up-to-date data that is actually highly accurate, and that we can use to support exploration investments. And that, I guess, is an ongoing challenge. Where this kind of again ties back to the many of the things like your rare earths and other critical materials is that it's only through opening up these new operations that we are able to sort of build up this capacity. But this kind of brings me to I think the last element, which is how Minerals Council is thinking of many of these issues, not just from a sort of global trade perspective and how do we position ourselves from an economic strategy point of view, but from a human perspective. And one of the big shifts that happened from the within the mining industry has been to adopt much more of a human or people-centered approach towards the industry's positioning and its role in society. Right, and this kind of has two roles. One of them is that the industry, I think, generally does recognize many of the challenges associated with climate change, right? And many of the critical raw materials that we're talking about are utilized in a range of these new solutions, whether it's in sort of supercapacitors or battery and EV technology, wind turbines, all of these sort of advanced materials. But there's a connection to that which is critical, which is around how do we ensure that these transitions happen in a way without fundamentally breaking South African society. And this is a real challenge, particularly for South Africa, which is in many ways dependent on existing fossil fuel driven industries. So if you look at coal, like we know that coal has a particular lifespan that is going to end out, and we know that coal is dirty, and these are the realities. At the same time, there is no easy way that you can go to 1 million people in the Mpumalanga region and say to them, well, you're all going to be unemployed now, good luck, and we're going to switch to solar. Right? That's not a conversation that is going to benefit anyone in the long term. So many of the conversations are really around how do we ensure that there is this just transition, that there is a dignified transition away from these kind of older traditional energy sources towards new energy sources, and how do we do it in a way that does not literally break the country? If we think that South African mining currently employs about 500,000 people, more or less, 460 odd thousand, there are maybe 5 million people who are dependent on the mining industry as for their livelihoods, and switching that industry on or off has catastrophic implications for the country and for the region, not just for the economy. So this question of a human-centered approach is critical, and how do we balance the very real need to develop these technologies that are dependent on new materials, that give us opportunities to open up new operations in new mines, which create jobs, create economic opportunity, with the demise of industries utilizing older technologies and obviously pushing people into much more vulnerable positions. How do you handle migration patterns that kind of emerge out of this? And in many cases, a lot of the operations, whether it's in South Africa or further afield, are in more remote locations. And so you have the creation of ghost towns, and you have all of these kind of socioeconomic issues. And so the challenge that we have around, kind of circling back to the beginning, the challenge that we have around how do we build infrastructure across Africa? How do we kind of provide for the next 300, 400, 500 million people? This is going to come at an enormous human cost, not just environmental cost. And we need to be able to manage that process effectively and intelligently and rationally and responsibly in order for us to actually solve these very real needs. Otherwise, the social challenges are just going to come back and ultimately cause a range of other sort of further problems. So I've kind of taken us on a little bit of a journey around this, but really to say, the question of all of these critical raw materials are deeply rooted in many cases consumer demands, right? It's the demand for mobile phones, it's the demand for low cost power, it's the demands for all of these what we would often think are kind of like higher income needs, but the reality is that as people are achieving more income in across Africa, these demands are there. And those demands need to be obviously satisfied by us, really. And if not us, then it's going to be our competitors, and we're going to kind of fall away. And so maybe just to circle back in closing to the comment that my colleague made, why not South Africa? Like, we have certainly the skill sets, we have the infrastructure, we don't necessarily have the policy in place, but we have the people thinking about and designing the policy, and we have the correct attitude and intent to create some sort of just transition. And I think this for us is the central question going forwards. Thank you.